story of the IDF crossing into Africa begins at the northern end of Israel, 300 miles away. On October 12, 1973, a week after fire broke out, 3 Iraqi divisions and 2 Jordanian tank brigades arrived at the northern front. Along with the Syrian army, they launched a series of attacks on Israeli forces that were, by this time, deep inside Syrian territory. The combined Arab offensive failed miserably. No ground was gained and dozens of Arab tanks were destroyed. Within a day, a coordinated attack of 4 or 5 divisions was repelled by the Israelis, who by that point were expected to be on their last legs. For the Syrians, and even more so for the Soviets, it was panic time. In their mind, the imminent collapse of Syria and the Arab expeditionary forces was looming, and soon enough the IDF would be on the outskirts of Damascus. This was one humiliation the Soviet Union simply couldn't bear. Unbeknownst to them, Israel saw the situation quite differently. The forces that had repelled the joint Arab attacks were exhausted. Their tanks had been repeatedly patched up and they faced significant logistical challenges after days of continuous fighting. But the Soviets did not know that. What they did know, as it was no secret, was that Israel, with a population of barely 3 million people and a mostly reserve-based army, could not withstand a prolonged war. They believed Israel would need to create a pressure point, meaning a situation where its opponents would be forced into a ceasefire. The fear of a Syrian collapse compelled the Soviet Union to exert tremendous pressure on Sadat, the president of Egypt, to divert some of Israel's forces away from its northern front. He was urged to launch an attack on Israel that would keep the Israeli forces away from Damascus and consequently Syria still in the war. This was the moment Sadat gave in to his hubris, or perhaps to Soviet pressure, and decided to launch an offensive against the IDF in Sinai. Against the advice of its generals, particularly the Chief of Staff Shazli, Egypt initiated a massive attack on all the Sinai front on October 14th. This became one of the largest tank battles in history, with 1,800 Egyptian tanks facing 700 Israeli tanks along a front that was less than 100 miles long. By the end of the day, Egypt lost 200 to 250 tanks, while Israel lost just over 20. The failed Egyptian attack brought an end to a constant debate and hesitation on the Israeli side. On one side was Ariel Sharon, who had been pushing to end the war by crossing the canal into Egypt, and on the other were the more cautious IDF generals, who saw this as a gamble on the very existence of the young state. And here we must add a few words about Ariel Sharon. Although he was only a division commander at the time of the war, he had been the head of Southern Command just 3 months before the war erupted. He was a popular figure in the public eye and a respected authority within the IDF. In short, he carried far more gravitas than a typical division commander would. After Egypt's failed offensive on the 14th, even the most conservative generals of the IDF believed the odds have shifted slightly and the crossing of the canal into Africa was now a viable option. There was no real question as where to cross. Reconnaissance patrol confirmed that the area near the Bitter Lake was largely free of significant Egyptian forces. It seems Egypt assumed that the natural barrier of the Bitter Lake would be enough to prevent an Israeli crossing. The real challenge was how to make the crossing. In the years leading up to the war, Israel invested in a unique rolling bridge that could be pulled and pushed by tanks across the canal. But at the time, no one anticipated that the Egyptian army would control 8 miles of the canal east side. The rolling bridge was massive, 200 meters long and weighing 220 tons. Dragging this mammoth across sand dunes for 20 miles through mostly enemy-controlled territory seemed both impractical and highly risky given the condition Israel faced at that moment. But the war kept dragging on, and the Israeli government saw no alternative but to attempt a crossing in order to outflank the Egyptian army. With no reliable air support and no effective answer to the Egyptian anti-tank missiles, Israel was risking its remaining 700 tanks in the south to cross the canal not only without a bridgehead, but even without a bridge. Since Ariel Sharon, the 143rd Division commander, had been pushing for the crossing, his division was tasked with the operation. The designated crossing area had only one narrow road leading to it. Since no one in the South Front Command had planned for it in advance, the road quickly became clogged with all kinds of vehicles. Fuel and ammunition trucks, water carriers, and technical support vehicles were all stuck, unable to move anywhere. An entire battalion for the 421st Brigade was assigned to tow the roller bridge, but they faced numerous challenges. The sand dunes were too high for the bridge to pass, requiring tractors to level the terrain. Tank shackles kept breaking, and by the afternoon of the 15th, the bridge itself broke down and needed extensive welding. It became clear that the roller bridge wouldn't make it to the canal that night. When Choron and his officer turned their attention to the barges, they realized that the white barges would never pass through the clogged road on time. Choron officers openly expressed doubts. Reaching the canal and establishing a bridgehead would be costly, and without a bridge in sight, it could all be in vain. But Choron insisted, if we don't cross tonight, the Egyptians will change their positions and the Jews will change their minds. We must cross with whatever we have. Then someone remembered the Gilloise ferries. These self-propelled barges, designed by a French engineer, had been rejected by NATO as crossing devices due to their extreme vulnerability. Abandoned in some forest in Europe, they were eventually purchased by the Mossad under the guise of agricultural equipment. In Israel, the barges initially attracted little interest. They were repaired but ultimately left idle in some yard. Now they seem to be the only hope. Self-propelled and relatively small, they could maneuver on the road and reach the canal in time if the IDF could secure a bridgehead in the first place. To create a diversion and keep the Egyptian eyes elsewhere, the 600th Brigade attacked next to Television Ridge, what was held by the Egyptian army. The reconnaissance 87th Battalion led the 14th Brigade to the canal. From 6 p.m. until 8 p.m. the journey was completed. The 79th Battalion reached 5 miles north of the junction, when 184th Battalion followed just north of the junction. At 21:20, the 184th commander reported on the radio that all hell broke loose. He was fired upon from a well-defended anti-tank position. The 184 lost 10 tanks immediately. The battalion commander charged with a few tanks to the north, while the remaining force kept on fighting on Lexicon Tier 2. Soon it became clear that things were not going well. The 14th Brigade commander realized his forces were split. He called back the 79th Battalion, and with the remaining of 184, tried to establish a line next to the junction. Altogether, 16 tanks were left to fend the Egyptian 16th and 21st Divisions. Sharon ordered the 600th Brigade, which at the time had only 2 battalions, to keep on pushing from his side. The 410th Battalion, which was at Point Sagol 194, was ordered to charge the Egyptian positions. The 14th Brigadier struggled to organize his brigade and fend off 16th Division constant attacks. Meanwhile, the 247th paratrooper got closer to the canal. To establish some bridgehead on the Egyptian side, the 247 reserves was supposed to cross on rubber dinghies and clear the eastern side. Due to incredible traffic jam and constant delays, Danny Matt, the 247th Brigadier, reached Lacakan area only after midnight, approximately 4 hours later than planned. His brigade advanced under fire to Nakhala, and on 1:20 he reached the yard. The yard was an outpost with high sand ramps on the banks of the canal. At 1:30, Danny Matt radioed the code word, meaning he reached the west side. By 3 a.m. of October 16th, he was all set with the rest of his brigade, 760 paratroopers, and by morning he made it to York. Meanwhile, the battle on Tier 2 junction carried on. Hundreds of Egyptian infantry with RPG were firing at Israeli tanks on the junction. From time to time, 4 or 5 Egyptian tanks were charging at the Israeli positions. The morning fog made it impossible to see much, and ranges of fire were reduced to a few meters, while ammunition trucks and artillery deposits were exploding everywhere. The 14th Brigade that was sent to attack the Egyptian 16th Division ended up accidentally attacking 16th logistical depots, and by early morning lost half its tank and suffered numerous casualties. While fierce fire exchange was at the junction, there was still no sign of any bridge getting nearer to the canal. The barge was stuck in the clogged road, and the roller bridge kept breaking in the sandy dunes. Without any other viable option, Sharon ordered to move ahead with the Gilloise. With the first light, some of them reached the water edge. By 7 a.m., the first Israeli tank have crossed the canal. While remnants of the 14th Brigade were fighting on the junction, 247th Paratrooper finally got tank support. The desert morning fog reduced the battlefield at the junction to a few yards, sometimes resulting in tanks ramming each other. Neither side showed any intention of giving way. The tank battle at the junction continued all morning, leaving the 14th Brigade with less than 50 operable tanks. Dayan, Dado, and Gonen were alarmed by the lack of corridor to the canal. A slight breach in the IDF lines could result in part of their army being stranded in Egypt. Sharon sensed the hesitancy and radioed in the morning that everything was going great, and the enemy was about to collapse. This was a blatant lie, and everyone knew it. Sharon felt his superior needed encouragement just as much as his subordinates. In the meantime, the 421st Tanks Brigade kept crossing into Africa. By 10:15, 27 tanks had crossed the canal, accompanied by around 700 paratroopers. They surprised the Egyptian forces and reached Masecha by noon, then advanced to Tzach and Maktsara. 10 Egyptian tanks and 25 armored vehicles were destroyed. The aggressive patrol took over 3 SAM missile sites, effectively clearing the sky for the Israeli Air Force to operate again. The 14th Brigade received orders from Ariel Sharon to take over all the division tanks east of the canal, by now barely 40 in total, and push against the 16th Division. 8 tanks attacked Tier 2, while the brigade commander, with a few more tanks, launched an assault from the west. Although some ground was gained, the Israeli High Command still refused to acknowledge that they were facing 2 well-armed Egyptian divisions entrenching irrigation ditches with no intention of going anywhere. Tension on the Israeli side ran high. They had 27 tanks on the Egyptian side of the canal, potentially able to sever the Egyptian army. But there was still no viable corridor to supply the bridgehead or the small force on the Egyptian side. While Sharon pushed for more tanks to cross, even without a safe corridor, his superiors felt that it was a huge risk and suspected that Sharon was motivated by self-aggrandizement. The difference between Ariel Sharon and the rest of the IDF general was both strategic and a matter of disposition. Gonen, Dado, and Barlev wanted to play it safe and secure a corridor, while Sharon believed that Kavish Road was sufficient to supply his forces even though it was under fire from the north. For Sharon, the advantages of severing the Egyptian army seemed worth the risk, and he believed that eventually the IDF would manage to lay a bridge across the canal. The murmurs and allegations continued. The usually restrained Chief of Staff, Dado, had a conversation with the Minister of Defense, Dayan, during which he vented his frustration about Sharon, whom he believed was more focused on politics than following orders. Dayan, who by that time had regained his composure, responded with something very close to, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Before 11 o'clock, Sharon's fears came true. He was ordered to stop allowing tanks to cross the canal and to focus on securing the corridor. With no tanks left to spare, Sharon suggested that 162nd Division might take on the task. Aden immediately agreed and sent 217th Brigade to attack the Egyptian forces on Tier 2. After a few of his tanks were hit, the 217th Brigade Commander, Neil, who had already suffered terrible losses on the failed attack on October 8th, correctly assumed that there would be an anti-tank ambush in the area. Politely but firmly, he stalled with all sorts of excuses, unable to bring himself to sacrifice more of his people and tanks. On the evening of October 16th, the first day of the crossing, it was clear to the IDF general that Egypt High Command still did not realize what had happened. The Egyptians thought that the fire exchange on the west side of the canal were just patrol of a small force that did not pose a serious threat. However, late in the evening, Egypt truly grasped the situation. How, you may ask, has Sadat finally came to realize the threat to his army? Soviet satellite photos, intelligence report, maybe report from his own officers in the field. I kid you not, Sadat learned about the small force on his side of the canal from the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, announcing it to the whole world on the Israeli Knesset. Golda Meir did this against the advice of her chief of staff, creating chaos that would eventually cost hundreds of Israeli casualties. Perhaps it was the tremendous pressure she was under, or maybe she was simply past her prime. But it is clear it was not a slip of the tongue. She was reading from a written statement, thus endangering the entire operation and her army. One cannot overstate the alarm bells Meir's announcement raised in Moscow and Cairo. In their mind, if Meir felt confident enough to make such a public statement, it must have meant that there was a serious IDF force on the Egyptian side of the canal, and not just 27 tanks without any logistical support. Immediately, Sadat sent his chief of staff, Shazli, to personally examine the situation on the front, while the Soviet Prime Minister flew to Cairo on the same night. Bar-Lev, or perhaps Gonen, came up with a brilliant idea. If the 143rd and 162nd Divisions couldn't open the corridor and secure Tirtur Road, why not send a paratrooper battalion to clear the road at night? The Chief of Staff, Dado, agreed, even though the Defense Minister, Dayan, has expressed his concern about the logic of this action several times. Even if there had been any logic sending 200th Infantry to clear an area two armored divisions have failed to secure, the bizarre announcement by the Israeli Prime Minister only strengthened the Egyptian resolve. And so, late at night, the 890 Battalion was sent to clear Tirtur Road. No intelligence reports were provided to Yairi, the paratrooper brigadier, or to Mordechai, the battalion commander. The Egyptian 16th Division patiently waited for the 890 to get within a few tens of yards before opening fire with machine guns. To put it simply, the 890 was butchered in one of the most controversial battles Israel has ever faced. The rest of the night was devoted to caring for the wounded and devising a plan to extract the remaining force. Several attempts were made to assist 890 Battalion, or at least to evacuate the wounded. Yairi and Aden requested several times to evacuate what was left of 890. Most of the battalion was dead or wounded, and those who remained alive were out of ammunition after the long night. Gonen vehemently refused any withdrawal. At 11 a.m. Bar-Lev, Gonen caretaker general, entered the Southern Command war room and heard about the battered 890 Battalion. He immediately ordered an evacuation. On the morning of the 17th, Shazli radioed back that the Israelis indeed had a bridgehead north of the Bitter Lake. From 8:20 onward, Egypt's army unleashed all they had on the bridgehead. 144 artillery barrels and numerous airstrikes targeted the area, while the Egyptian 25 Elite Tank Brigade was ordered to attack from the south. The brigade commander was far from eager. His elite T-62 tanks were to charge a well-fortified positions in broad daylight without any support or room to maneuver. But President Sadat insisted, and with a heavy heart, Chief of Staff Shazli gave the order. The attack would go ahead. Clouds of dust rose into the air, visible from miles away. At 14:15, Israeli tanks opened fire from a distance. When the 217th Brigade realized that long-range fire was ineffective against the thick armor of the T-62, they pushed the 113 and 126 Battalion forward to close the distance. Some of the 25th Brigade tanks attempted to break out to the northeast, only to come under heavy fire from 126. By nightfall, the 25th Brigade had been shattered. Only 10 tanks remained. An elite armored force had been reduced to rubble, with nothing to show for. By the evening of the 17th, the Verge's bridge was set, but no one was crossing on it. The 162nd Division was supposed to send 460 Brigade to cross to the west side. But after a day of fighting and maneuvering, the 460 was short on fuel and ammunition. Once again, logistical issues, compounded by blocked roads and lack of effective leadership from Southern Front Command, made it almost impossible to resupply the tanks. It might have made more sense to send 143rd Division across the canal and leave 162nd to secure the corridor. But by this point, internal politics within the IDF were taking over. Gonen, Dado and Bar-Lev didn't want Ariel Sharon to take the credit, so they insisted that 162nd Division be the first across the newly built bridge. But the 162nd was busy resupplying, and as a result, it wasn't until midnight, 8 hours after the bridge was ready, that the 460th Brigade finally began to cross. And even then, the tanks were only half fueled. Meanwhile, the Egyptians did everything they could to curb the looming threat. The commander of the Second Army received explicit order from Sadat himself to do all he could to block the IDF corridor on the east side, while sending the mechanized 3rd Division from the outskirts of Cairo to the bridgehead. On the morning of the 18th, 600th Brigade moved cautiously north, only to discover there was no one there. Apparently, by that time, the 16th Division was so depleted that barely any infantry were left on the farm. Yet as the 600th Brigade advanced closer to the canal, missiles were fired from the farmhouses. The 14th Brigadier identified an opportunity and charged the farmhouses from the southwest. Before sunset, the IDF had full control of the farm. Finally, it was time for the roller bridge to do its job. The bridge was stowed by tanks from the 410th Battalion and reached the canal by 1800. While bulldozers were busy clearing the canal banks, 401 Brigade from 252nd Division was ordered to cross the canal under 162nd Division. With 500th Brigade that had crossed earlier, the IDF now had 5 tank brigades, totaling 280 tanks west of the canal. With the roller bridge in place from 440 of the 19th, the tide has truly turned. The collapse of the Egyptian stronghold at the farm, combined with the new bridge spanning the canal, marked a turning point. From that moment, it became an entirely different war.